the Iceman.
He was found in a glacier, frozen in time for 5,000 years.
An ancient mystery.
What can we learn from him? What is his story?
For 5,000 years, the Alpine ice guarded Europe's ultimate cold case. When Ötzi the Iceman was discovered, science built a legend, a fair-skinned, hairy ancestor mapping the very roots of Western civilization. It was a perfect story, and it was completely wrong. 3 decades later, a drill bit piercing deep into his pelvic bone has unlocked a pristine, uncorrupted strand of DNA, demolishing 30 years of history, exposing a massive scientific illusion and revealing a man who looked radically different than anyone dared to imagine. The pelvic revelation. High on a wind-scoured ridge in the Ötztal Alps, 5,000 years of silence ended with a mistake. When 2 German hikers stumbled upon a brown, leathery torso melting out of the Similon Glacier in 1991, they thought they had found a tragic modern mountaineer. Instead, they had breached a time capsule. For 3 decades, Ötzi the Iceman reigned as the undisputed rock star of archaeology. He was the world's premier chalkboard for teaching ancient European prehistory. In 2012, when a team of geneticists published his first complete genome sequence, the world nodded in satisfaction. The data confirmed exactly what the textbooks expected. Ötzi was a proud, fair-skinned, heavily bearded representative of the early European hunter-gatherers, mixed with a dash of Eastern steppe herders. His genetic signature placed him firmly in the family tree of modern-day Sardinians and Northern Europeans. It was neat, it was comfortable, and as it turns out, it was a total illusion. Let's look at the messy, microscopic reality of ancient DNA retrieval. When a body sits on a mountain for 50 centuries, its genetic code doesn't stay pristine. It degrades, breaking apart into millions of tiny, fragile fragments. But the real enemy isn't time, it's us. Every archaeologist who handled the mummy in 1991, every technician who moved him to the cold storage vault in Bolzano, Italy, and every scientist who prepared those early tissue samples shed hair, skin cells, and microscopic droplets of sweat. When the 2012 genome was sequenced, technology required amplifying the DNA, essentially making millions of copies of the fragments they found. But because the sequencing tech back then was relatively primitive, it couldn't easily distinguish between the deep past and the immediate present. Modern European DNA from the researchers themselves had leaked into the samples. The machines scrambled the codes together, blending 50-century-old genes with 21st-century genetic noise. Science hadn't just mapped the Iceman, they had mapped the very people studying him. The breakthrough that shattered this illusion didn't happen on a mountain peak, but inside the ultra-sterile labs of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. Geneticist Johannes Krause and his team realized that if they wanted the absolute truth, they had to go deeper into the anatomy of the mummy than anyone had ever gone before. They needed a site completely shielded from 30 years of human touch. They chose the pelvis. Using a specialized, high-precision surgical drill, scientists bored directly into the dense core bone of Ötzi's hip. From the interior of that pelvic matrix, they extracted a tiny sample of bone dust that had been sealed off from the outside world since the Copper Age. This wasn't the degraded, surface-level tissue of previous studies. This was deep, uncorrupted, ancient biological architecture. The team then deployed a state-of-the-art methodology known as high-coverage sequencing. Think of the 2012 genome as a blurry, low-resolution photograph taken with a cheap camera. High-coverage sequencing is a modern 8K digital scan. The team read every single string of Ötzi's DNA up to 30 times over. This extreme repetition allowed them to mathematically isolate and throw out any modern human fragments, which tend to look cleaner and longer than ancient shattered DNA. When the clean, unpolluted data finally flickered onto the laboratory monitors, the collective jaw of the scientific community hit the floor. The Eastern European steppe ancestry? Gone. The genetic links to modern Scandinavian populations vaporized. The story that had stood as historical gospel for a generation wasn't just slightly off. It was a complete inversion of reality. But if his code wasn't what we thought, who was the man hidden under the ice? The myth of the Pale Hunter. If you walk into the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, you will find yourself face to face with a legend. For years, the centerpiece of the exhibit has been a breathtaking, life-sized, hyper-realistic reconstruction of Ötzi. Created by world-renowned paleo artists, this model depicts a rugged, sinewy warrior. He has light, weather-beaten Caucasian skin, deep-set grey-blue eyes, and a wild, magnificent mane of thick, flowing brown hair, and a matching, untamed beard. He looks exactly like the quintessential European forefather, a primitive mountain man surviving against the elements. This image has been stamped onto millions of documentary covers, textbooks, and magazine articles. It is the visual identity of the Copper Age. There is just one problem. It is a work of pure fiction. When the Max Planck Institute's high-coverage pelvic DNA results were translated into physical traits, they acted like a genetic wrecking ball to this iconic imagery. The genes that dictate pigmentation and physical characteristics do not lie, and Ötzi's code told a story that was radically different from the statue in the glass case. The pale hunter-gatherer was gone. In his place stood someone who challenged every deeply held bias about what an ancient European looked like. The first major shockwave rolled through the laboratory when technicians analyzed the pigmentation markers, specifically the specific single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, that control melanin production in human skin. The old 2012 data, muddled by modern European contamination, suggested his skin tone was fair, resembling modern Alpine or Northern European populations. But the clean, uncorrupted pelvic sample revealed an entirely different palette. Ötzi's genome carried heavily dark pigmentation variants. In fact, his skin was remarkably dark, significantly darker than that of modern Mediterranean populations. If you were to place him next to a modern European, his complexion would closely resemble individuals from contemporary North Africa or the Indian subcontinent. He was not a fair-skinned wanderer bleaching in the Alpine sun. He was naturally deeply dark-complexioned. Then came the crowning blow to his legendary appearance: the hair. The iconic museum reconstruction owes much of its wild, prehistoric charisma to its flowing locks. But when scientists scanned the specific genetic loci associated with hair loss and male pattern baldness, they found a severe genetic predisposition. Ötzi was carrying multiple high-risk genetic variants for alopecia, the medical term for hair loss. This discovery completely changes how we must visualize his final days on the mountain. He did not possess a thick, protective mane of hair to shield his neck from the freezing mountain winds. Instead, his genetic clock was ticking aggressively toward advanced baldness. When he died in his mid-40s, an advanced age for the Copper Age, he was almost certainly experiencing severe hair thinning, likely leaving him with a mostly bare, exposed scalp. Suddenly, the image of the hairy, pale caveman dissolved. The reality was far more fascinating. A man with dark, intense skin, striking dark eyes, and a bald head, navigating the jagged peaks of the Alps. The mummified remains themselves actually support this new genetic profile. For decades, when observers looked at the actual mummy lying in its refrigerated chamber, they noticed that its skin was remarkably dark brown and completely hairless. However, early taphonomists, scientists who study how bodies decay, dismissed this. They argued that the extreme pressure of the glacial ice and the unique chemical environment of the freezing environment had artificially darkened his skin over 5 millennia, while simultaneously causing all his body hair to fall out. While the ice certainly played a role in preservation, the new DNA analysis proves that the mummy's dark color wasn't a trick of post-mortem decay. It was his actual biological reality. This revelation exposes a profound psychological truth about the history of science. For 30 years, researchers and the public alike easily accepted a reconstruction that looked like a modern Western European because it fit an established, comfortable narrative of ancestral continuity. We wanted him to look like us, so we ignored the literal evidence of our eyes and trusted contaminated data that confirmed our biases. But rewriting his face and skin is only the beginning of the disruption. Changing how he looked forces us to completely reevaluate where he came from and how his ancestors fit into the grand, shifting mosaic of human migration. A bald, dark-skinned farmer in the frozen peaks. How on earth did he get there? The ghost lineage of Anatolia. How did this dark-skinned, balding man end up on an Alpine ridge? We have to redraw the map of ancient Europe. For decades, the prevailing narrative stated that Ötzi's bloodline was forged in the great melting pot of the continent, a roughly equal mix of indigenous Western hunter-gatherers and aggressive nomadic pastoralists known as the Yamnaya, who swept out of the Eastern European steppes on horseback during the late Neolithic period. This steppe ancestry was thought to be the defining genetic engine that shaped the Bronze and Copper Ages of Europe. But when the clean pelvic DNA data passed through the servers at the Max Planck Institute, that entire historical framework collapsed. The steppe herder signature didn't just shrink, it vanished completely. Instead, the geneticists discovered that over 92% of Ötzi's ancestry came from a single specific source: early Anatolian farmers. These were the descendants of the radical agriculturalists who left the fertile plains of modern-day Turkey roughly 8,000 years ago, migrating northwest into the Balkans and up through the major river valleys of Europe, carrying the secrets of wheat, barley, and domesticated livestock with them. This percentage is astronomically high. To put it into perspective, by the time Ötzi was wandering the Alps in 3300 BCE, most European populations had spent thousands of years intermarrying with the local hunter-gatherer tribes they encountered, creating a highly blended genetic landscape. Yet, Ötzi's DNA looked like a pristine time capsule from the early days of the agricultural revolution. He was a genetic ghost, a living relic of an Anatolian past that had long since faded across the rest of the continent. This extraordinary purity tells a vivid story of extreme geographic and social isolation. Ötzi's ancestors didn't live in a sprawling, interconnected European trade network. They were trapped in an evolutionary pocket. Thousands of years before his birth, a group of these Anatolian-descended farmers migrated into the deep, jagged valleys of the Alps, likely settling in the Vinschgau region of modern-day South Tyrol. Once inside those towering mountain walls, they stopped mixing with the outside world. The high ridges and treacherous passes acted as a massive stone barrier, cutting them off from the grand migrations, wars, and genetic shifts happening across the flatlands of Europe. For generation after generation, spanning centuries, his people married exclusively within their own small network of valley communities. They became an island of isolated agrarian culture, maintaining their distinct genetic markers, their dark skin, and their unique physical traits, while the rest of Europe was rapidly changing color and composition. Living in this Alpine pressure cooker didn't just preserve their bloodline, it shaped their entire existence. These weren't primitive cavemen. They were highly adapted, sophisticated high-altitude farmers and herders. They managed crops in the valley floors, pastured animals on the lower slopes, and learned to exploit the rich mineral resources of the mountains, mining copper to forge the very axe that Ötzi carried on his final journey. They had conquered the vertical landscape, turning a hostile wilderness into a permanent home. Yet, this absolute isolation was a double-edged sword. While it protected their ancient lineage from being absorbed by the massive waves of migrating steppe herders, it also meant they were entirely dependent on the volatile, unforgiving mechanics of their immediate environment. In a world where resources were locked in tight, competitive valleys, survival was a brutal game of territorial defense. Isolation kept his bloodline pure, but it also made him a walking target. The final 24 hours, blood, bows, and flint. To walk with Ötzi through his final hours is to witness a breathless thriller playing out across the vertical landscape of the Stone Age. For decades, scientists viewed his death as a solitary accident, a hunter freezing to death in a sudden Alpine whiteout. But the physical evidence locked in his equipment, his wounds, and his digestive tract tells a far more violent story. The new genetic data reveals an isolated community, and forensic science proves that this isolation was fiercely lethally defended. Ötzi's final 24 hours were a desperate, high-stakes flight for survival. Thanks to modern archaeobotanical analysis, we can reconstruct his movements using the microscopic pollen grains trapped inside his stomach and intestines. The timeline is precise and frantic. He began his final day down in the valley floor, amidst the warmth of the subalpine deciduous forests. The presence of hop-hornbeam pollen in his gut proves he was down low, close to the agricultural settlements of his people. But something went catastrophically wrong. A violent clash erupted, a territorial dispute, a blood feud, or a sudden raid on his mountain village. We know this because of his right hand. Sometime during this valley confrontation, Ötzi suffered a deep, agonizing stab wound directly into the webbed flesh between his thumb and index finger. It is a textbook defensive injury. He had reached out with his bare hand to catch the blade of an attacking enemy. The wound was deep, cutting down to the bone, and it had not begun to heal when he died. Bleeding, exhausted, and pursued by enemies, Ötzi fled. He didn't just walk away, he launched into a grueling vertical sprint up the mountain face, ascending thousands of feet into the freezing, high-altitude Alpine zone. He climbed toward the safety of the rocky crags, hoping the treacherous terrain would swallow his tracks. As he climbed, he was frantically preparing for war. Found alongside his body was a pristine, unfinished longbow made of yew wood, along with a leather quiver containing 14 arrows. Crucially, only 2 of those arrows were fully completed with flint heads and stabilizing feathers. The other 12 were rough, unfinished shafts. He was running out of ammunition, desperately carving weapons on the run, while his injured, bandaged hand throbbed with agony. High up on the Tisenjoch Pass, at 11,000 feet, Ötzi finally paused. Believing he had outrun his pursuers, he sat down against a large rock to eat what would become his last meal. A heavy, high-fat feast of dried ibex meat, red deer fat, and ancient einkorn wheat grains. The sheer volume of fat in his stomach indicates he needed high-density energy to fight off the creeping hypothermia of the peaks. But his pursuers hadn't lost his trail. They had tracked him up the vertical slopes, navigating the identical rocky paths. As Ötzi sat resting, an enemy closed the distance, hiding behind the jagged stone outcrops. There was no face-to-face duel, no honorable tribal combat. A single flint-tipped arrow tore through the freezing mountain air, striking Ötzi directly from behind. The projectile entered his left shoulder blade, piercing his back and severing his subclavian artery, the massive blood vessel supplying the arm. The internal bleeding was catastrophic and immediate. Within minutes, his vision faded, and the dark-skinned, balding farmer collapsed face down into a shallow gully, bleeding out into the snow. His killer walked up, ripped the wooden arrow shaft out of his back to hide their identity, but left his priceless copper axe behind. The ice closed over his body, preserving a crime scene that would remain undisturbed for 50 centuries. A legacy preserved by crime, only to be falsified by modern science. Complex, ancient Europe. The arrow that killed Ötzi did far more than end a single life. It locked away a genetic truth that would take 5 millennia to explode. By freezing this Anatolian farmer in time, the glacier preserved a vivid snapshot of a European continent that was far more dynamic, visually diverse, and fractured than modern history ever suspected. The comfortable, homogenized myth of a uniformly fair-skinned, homogeneous prehistoric Europe has melted away alongside the Alpine ice. Instead, Ötzi forces us to view ancient Europe as a complex, vibrant patchwork of isolated genetic islands and sudden, sweeping migrations. It was a world where a community could live in dark-skinned, balding isolation for thousands of years, just miles away from rapidly transforming flatlands. It reminds us that history doesn't move in a straight line, and our ancestors cannot be neatly retrofitted into modern definitions of identity or appearance. For 30 years, we looked at a contaminated ghost and saw a reflection of ourselves. We allowed a narrative built on accidental 20th century sweat and skin cells to dictate the face of the Copper Age, assuming our ancestors must look identical to contemporary populations. Now, the uncorrupted code from a single pelvic bone has forced us to open our eyes to the true, unvarnished past. Ötzi was a pioneer, a survivor, and a casualty of a brutal, competitive world, but above all, he is a reminder that science must always be willing to destroy its own favorite theories when the truth demands it. As the planet warms and the global thermostat rises, the ancient glaciers of the world are retreating at an unprecedented pace. Deep within the permafrost of the Alps, the Andes, and the Siberian tundra, other frozen time capsules are slowly rising toward the light. Every shard of ice holds a secret, and every ancient bone waits to speak. The rewriting of human history hasn't ended with Ötzi, it has only just begun. If you want to stay on the cutting edge of history as the ice continues to melt, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next upload. What will the glaciers reveal next? Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.